Well, kwakay dun ko nga makawa jabut nga mingo nga angay kakakil nga gugjali apaslik abawlik ka maglik ka suk nakhal ngos o kagagak su anakdak su jali ilanak. Hello everyone, my Yukton name is Machak. I grew up in the village of Fornik, Alaska, which is in the Bethel region. Um, I am the son of Victor and Leona Wiseman, and I'm the descendants of Nakhalnok and Gagugak and Inagayuli and Anakdok. I'm currently a senior here at CSBSJU, and I am the president of the Indigenous Student Association. And I thought I'd welcome you all here by opening up with who I am, and I will pass it on to our fellow panelists.
Well, you already know who I am. But I've been a trauma therapist for the past 30 plus years. I work especially with historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and I've been working in Indian country for the bulk of that 30 years with diverse populations. So I'm really happy to be here. I've been fortunate to have been taught by a lot of really good people in not only in the area but in the world, and I'm just really happy to be able to share some of those things with you tonight. Miigwech.
Oshu, I'm Jamie Arsenault. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at White Earth. Oh, can you not hear me? No. How about now? Do I have to really yell? Okay. So my name is Jamie. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at White Earth. And I've been working, doing repatriation and working with different communities for over 25.
Use the
Or maybe now. That's okay. In and out. Hold on. So anyway, I've been working in Native communities for over 25 years, and I'm just happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Joe Lagarde, White Earth, basically, well, my name is Gimme Wind, which means rain. But, yeah, been working on change for all our lives, I guess. You know. So I could put this Navy Center together as a way to, actually what I started out is I wanted to promote the woman, give them their voice back. And that's been missing since, you know, like colonizers, it's always the man that's front. I have my daughters, I have my granddaughters, and have a space for them up front. So, actually, when I found at Notre Dame, tell them to get the woman the bishop said it was going to make change. And on the other hand, change does happen within that Catholic Church, because we've seen what Doctrine and Discovery go by the wayside recently. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. Old papal bull laws that actually were written into what they call the Marshall Trilogy, federal Indian law, which basically, like Johnson versus McIntosh, basically give them the right to over on their lands. Because we're not human, I guess. I don't know. But, oh, they looked at it, and that's what happened. This is a co-worker.
I'm Amy Misko. I'm the program manager at Navy Center. I work with Joe. It's an incredible privilege and honor to be able to live and work on White Earth and to help further the healing and the indigenous sovereignty and protecting the earth and the water, which is how Joe found me in protecting the water. And so it's really an honor to be here, and I'm not exactly on the panel, but I'm just going to sit here for moral support.
Well, before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. So the reason we are all here today and the reason I invited these amazing people is because of our history of boarding schools on our campuses in the past. The purpose of the boarding schools was to quote kill the Indian and save the man, and to civilize Native people, because the white man was like, oh look, they're real different people. Let's make them the way that we live. And so that happened. And because of that, the topics like historical trauma came into place, and generational trauma, and all these other problems have all been hidden until now. Today, we're now beginning to acknowledge all of the things that are the things that have happened in the past, and how we can move forward and start our journey towards healing. And so the panelists, they all do different things within the Native nations, and I had some questions for them. So Jamie, as she as she said, she's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the White Earth Nation, and I just want to know for everyone, like, what does your work do to what does your work contribute to the journey towards healing?
So, can you hear me? This is on, okay. So, it's really, my position's really divided into 3 different roles. So, one is I've recognized that the land base for the White Earth Reservation, it shrunk dramatically over the years because of, outright theft and dispossession of tribal lands. So I think it went down to like 7 or 8% of the reservation's tribal land now. So it really was reduced significantly. So those areas that are historically significant and also significant now to families, maybe they're gathering places or burial places, maybe they are places where folks go racing or fishing, or they're just really meaningful locations. My position is really to know where those spaces are. So when there are projects planned, whether it's somebody wants to expand a road or they want to build a home or something, that I know that we can do those things without interfering with these traditional spaces that have meaning. We can have both. And so I try to find that balance. The other thing is that in addition to the dispossession of the land and the removal of the children, there was really like a knowledge grab from the community. So, documentation about the people or their knowledge, whether it's medicines or certain historic events, whether it's sacred items or items of significance to the community. Oftentimes, those individual pieces, whether they were items or relatives or pieces of information, were removed from the community, and then they were spread throughout the world, really, because we'll see auctions in Germany and there'll be an item from White Earth that holds a lot of meaning. And at the same time, maybe there's a museum in California, and at the same time, maybe somebody in Connecticut just cleaned out their basement and they found that they also have something. So I have to sort of track down where all of that is, sift through and figure out what it is that is significant to the people and bring that home. Find some way to bring that home. And there is a lot of value and knowledge comes home again, because, you know, things can be revitalized, they can be put back into use. And they can bring a lot of comfort within communities. So like, for example, you know, if you look at the necklace on Moses's neck, that's one of his early graduation gifts. But you know, it's kind of, it's called, I mean, in English they call it like a puzzle bag or a mystery bag. So inside it's really hard to get into, so you're not going to lose anything that's in there. And people would carry things that really meant something to them, whether, you know, whatever it may be. There were different sizes. But you don't see them used as much in community anymore. And so there's a artist named Greg Johnson out of Flambeau, and he really started seeing these in museums and wanted to put them back, revitalize them, breathe life back into them, put them back into the hands of the people, and start seeing them being worn again. So just this past week, you know, we spent some time and we learned how to make those bags again, based on what was taken away and put in these spaces. And so that's one of the first bags that's been made and put back into use outside of Flambeau, but still within the region. So it's those little things like that which are really, really important when you start stacking it all up. So there's songs, there's all kinds of bits of information that are removed. When they all start to come home again, it starts to, you know, it changes everyone around it. And so that's essentially what I do. I look for things and try to bring things home.
Thank you. Well, as you can see on here, Joe is the founder of NIBI Center and is a longtime Indigenous activist and advocate for his people. Joe, with the work that you do with NIBI, how does NIBI help educate on the history of boarding schools? And is NIBI doing anything right now with the journey of healing in Indian country? And before you answer that, can you talk about what NIBI is to the audience?
NIBI is basically it's a water center. That's what we work on, protecting our water, but mainly our monomen, our well rice, which is actually like the third prophecy of our people. And so, you know, it's sacred to us, and to have like the university and that, they have stopped any work on genetic engineering, but they're now, you know, doing their breeding program with their paddy rice. And so we're having the symposium again. What's it, 2 weeks?
Couple weeks.
Yeah, a couple of weeks, and working with the university. They'll come and give us some good words and say, look how good we're doing, you know, while we're over here. But that's the university, and I've worked well with them. I don't, you know, I have friends there that I've worked for over 30 years, one said. I mean, they've changed their ways. They've probably changed a lot too in that time working with the university and several colleges. Work with, not so much at work, come in and give talks, maybe about our ways and things like that. But, and down the road, one of the things, well, way back, built the American Indian movement. I don't know if anyone are aware of the American Indian movement, but we built that when I was a lot younger in Minneapolis at the time, but it's, you know, we're still going. But the change itself, the work that we're doing is, I mean, it has, I mean, there's so much there. I mean, you didn't realize it until we started doing interviews within the communities around historical trauma. And that's, you know, when it first hits you, that, you know, that it's not only me that understands, you know, that we're hurting and why are we hurting, you know, but now people are coming out and wanting to be a part and want, you know, to, and a lot like the one that's doing some of the interviews, he said that just about everyone there says this is a healing moment. It's been a long, long time coming. And so, and that's one of the things I'd like to thank Ted over here, Jamie, for getting this all together. But healing has to start someplace. At some time, I see it a lot in our communities where they don't really realize that they're, what's happened to them. And then now with interviewing and having meetings in the communities, it's starting to come out more. I just never realized how it affected that many people. I thought this, maybe a few people understood it, but yeah, the community needs healing, and so does the oppressors, I guess, need to change their ways too. So how many, it's a little different, but I've seen a few of you up north, right? Did I get a show of hands on what? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But I'd like to introduce Jamie here, just say a few words. Jamie's been an excellent find. She moved back from New Mexico to work with us. I found her in a ditch. But Jamie was actually big in putting a lot of the camps and making the camps, I've been protecting our water, but still trying to stop the pipeline, and that's where I noticed her, and luckily she came to work with us for change.
It's a compliment to call Jamie.
Jamie.
Jamie, Davey, it's okay. It's too tricky.
Amy, I'll make something.
So yeah, Levy Center, we have 4 main areas of programming that we focus on. We have women's gatherings, which like Joe was talking about earlier, is to empower the women in the White Earth community to do whatever they see necessary, whatever they feel they want to learn or share. And so the idea behind that being that the women inherently in Anishinaabe culture are the protectors of the water. Women tend the water and men tend the fire. And so by empowering women, Joe's thinking behind that in a deep way is that we will be ultimately protecting the water and the land if women have more inherent power in the society and the decision making, and can really embody and take on that role in a good way because they're being supported and being uplifted in those leadership roles. Our second programming is Rights of Nature work. And so we work with Rights of Menomin on the White Earth Reservation, where we're trying to codify the rights that Menomin was actually voted to be given, like the rights of a personhood on the tribe. But now we're helping the tribe figure out how to codify that in the legal system and how to enforce that. And we're going to be having an Anishinaabe Law Conference at the end of June, which is going to be inviting in some Indigenous folks to talk about how traditional knowledge is codified in tribal legal systems and how those systems can help to uplift tribal people and protect the land. And then we have our historical trauma program, which Joe was talking about. We go through the different communities, the villages, and we've been collecting interviews with elders, specifically boarding school survivors, also their family members, especially since a lot of the elders have passed along. And we're collecting videos of all of those stories about their experiences in the boarding schools so that we can archive them at the White Earth Archives, as well as potentially on our resource, sort of like an area in our website where we're gonna be hosting a lot of resources and a lot of videos and things that we're collecting. What program am I forgetting, Joe? Well, I guess that's good enough for now. No, because we're here talking about historical trauma, and we've been doing that work with TED and then with some other organizations, but partnering with folks to do that work.
Well, thank you. I don't know if many of you guys know, I noticed this too, talking with my friends who are also people of color. The topic of psychology within Indian country and Alaska Native communities usually gets disregarded because we tend to believe, you'll get better, like be a man, all those different stereotypes. And to my left here is Liv, and she is a mental health counselor who focuses on historical trauma, and she's also a certified EDMR therapist. Um, with the history of psychology within Indian country, what do you do when it comes to patients who suffer with historical trauma to help with healing?
Can everybody hear me? Because I'm not, I gave up mics a long time ago. That's a really good question. I think, I'd like to start by, let's reframe what historical trauma is in a context, right? Because Indigenous people carry wounds that are identified as historical trauma. And historical trauma doesn't necessarily mean this is something that happened a long time ago. It's actually been defined as an event, a traumatic event that was experienced by a group of people and also individually, the individual members of that group. And so it also is that there's history here, because this goes way, way back. But I never want to forget the full scope of what we're talking about when we talk about historical trauma, because we're not just talking about the survivors of historical trauma. We're also talking about the descendants of the perpetrators. And I've really done a lot of work on researching this, and some of my work led me to a man named Dan Barone, who was an Israeli psychologist. His mom was a Holocaust survivor. And he spent the first 30 years of his life working with survivors of the Holocaust. And after about 30 years, he said, geez, I wonder who's talking to the descendants of the perpetrators, because of course with the courts, a lot of those perpetrators were put to death, right? What about their relatives? Who's talking to them? And he found out actually that nobody was talking to them, and that they indeed also were suffering great shame, great injury, great secrecy. And Dan Barone, I actually identified what he called a double wall of shame, a double wall of silence, that he first saw with survivors, but then he also saw it within the descendants of the perpetrators. And in a lot of the work that I studied about his work, I really reflected on this country. And there are some significant differences between what happened in the German Holocaust from here that makes it harder to identify here. But we still can see where this hurts people, all of us. Some people carry those wounds as survivors. Some people carry those wounds as descendants of the perpetrators. Some people carry both. And that's a war that goes on within some people, okay? So I didn't want to ever leave anybody with the impression that this is a wound or an injury that's exclusive just to Indian country. It's this kind of trauma is an equal opportunity provider, right? We've all been touched by this. So what was your question again? Oh yeah, so that's my little preamble, because I think it's really important that we reframe that. So in EMDR therapy, what we are trained to do is to identify traumas that we can actually metabolize, or we can integrate, we can synthesize. And it has a lot to do with the way traumatic memory is stored in the mind, which is different than, what I had for dinner last night, or how we got here today. Many of you probably got here and you really have to remember where the speed traps are, or where the school zones are, or, where to stay away from traffic or construction. But pretty much you don't, you've learned everything you need to do to get here, right? So there's billions of bits of information, if we put all of you together collectively, that you experienced on your way here that, you don't have to think about, you don't have to remember. Your body took it in, sights, sounds, the colors of cars, the number of people, everything. But we don't hold on to it. But with a traumatic memory, the body literally doesn't know what's important and what's not, because that digestive process is interrupted, because the system just gets overwhelmed, right? So the body holds on to everything. And so trauma is not experienced in a way of like what we think about. Like, oh, I remember when my grandma died and it upsets me when I think about it. That is not a traumatic memory. Traumatic memory is really impacting our perceptions, our dispositions, our interpretations of the world around us, our reactions, our knee-jerk reactions, instincts, right? That's where traumatic experience can really negatively affect. So we may find even in talking today that there'll be emotions that come up. And what I would invite you all to do is to just be curious about that and notice, oh, I'm feeling defensive, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling embarrassed, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling ashamed, right? This may be, each one of us has this little slice of this historical trauma pie that's our responsibility to metabolize, to heal, to learn from, and to grow. And to me, this is how we are going to move forward in a world that will bring us to sustainability, where we can live together and we can have a future. We talk about 7 generations. I can't even see 2 generations, if I'm honest with myself. And in fact, over the last few years, I don't really think that much ahead, at all. And I've talked to a lot of people that struggle with that. So we have a lot of healing to do, and it's gonna be all of us. It can't just be on one group of people. It's all of us. So with EMDR therapy, when we're working with traumatic experience, typically what we want to do is to go to the earliest trauma first. When we're looking to identify those touchstone memories, if you think of clumps of grapes, this traumatic experience is organized in the brain much differently than what we have in long-term memory, which is chronological, which can abstract, which can plan, right? Which can tell the story. There's a narrative thread. Traumatic experience is not like that. And it's clumped together in ways that we don't recognize or understand. But if you think of the way grapes are, if we can get the memory that's the stem of the grapes, and we can work with that, all the rest of that material goes through, so that we don't have to go through every single thing that ever happened to somebody. That's one of the blessings about this work. So when we talk about historical trauma, and when I'm working with people, even if I'm not addressing that with my client, that is my mindset. This is where we're starting from. This is the beginning point. And that frame in my mind helps me to be available to my client from where they're at, and also keep myself in check. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I helping to facilitate this process to help with connection? Where am I getting triggered? How am I might be getting in the way, right? So that's the way we handle that. That's the short answer.
Thank you. As we all know, our colleges, CSVSJU, is a predominantly white institution. That's what PWI means. And many people really don't understand the hard history of our boarding schools. And when children were taken away from their families, you know, sacred items were also taken with. And that's what um, Jamie also looks at. Jamie, when it comes to our white counterparts and the historical sacred items from Native nations, do you have anything to like say? Because like I noticed like when I'm scrolling through the internet, not a lot of people understand how these things are important and how when bringing them back to the communities, um, how important that is for that community itself. Do you have like any comments on that? And
Expect it's gonna turn off on me at any minute. Um, Let me think. I think, geez, so every repatriation that I've been involved in has been a little different. So just when you think you've seen everything, you really haven't. It's kind of goes that way. But everyone that I've completed, and I've been doing this since I was about 6 years old. So there's been a lot of ancestors I've repatriated and items. So every time that I've worked with somebody or helped in some way, they've transformed over time. They themselves shift. You start to see them become a little lighter. They smile more. They almost feel this tremendous weight coming off of them. Even those individuals that in the beginning panic and say, well, if we return these items to source communities, then we're not going to have anything on our shelves. You know what will happen about scientific inquiry and all of that. And what usually ends up happening is they're usually, by the end of all of this, there ends up being a really strong relationship between the community and that institution. Similar to what we're seeing now, where we have groups of students that come up to White Earth twice a year and spend time, and there are community members there that really care about them. And you start to see there be this relationship back and forth, and those shelves are not empty. That knowledge about why this matters, that grows, and it there ends up being more available for people, not less. In terms of the significance of the items, it's different for each item, but frequently there were items of significance that were targeted because if you look at some of the ceremonial drums, for example, those ceremonies were the places where language would be the last stronghold for language. So all these types of practices and traditional ways that were being suppressed across the country, ceremony was where those places held on to the longest and the strongest. So the items associated with that would be directly targeted. The children of those who practice would be directly targeted to be sent away. And oftentimes across the country, you can still see areas where ceremonies are practiced way out in the bush or in a basement or at night, and there's partially, part of the reason for that is this history. Not always. Some of the items, again, like a drum, is looked at as being a living relative. So those items have a responsibility within the community, and a huge part of that responsibility is health and wellness. So if you remove that from the people. You're separating a relative, first of all. So those items, in a sense, become political prisoners, right? They're starving, they're not hearing their language, they're not able to fulfill their role to the people, and the people aren't able to go to that source for wellness or to gather. And so there's this imbalance that starts to happen. And you've sort of, you've seen that carry on from generation to generation. So every time there's a disruption in access to knowledge or access to rites of passage or access to healing or access to gathering or to hear your language or to learn your language, traditional burial practices, any of that stuff that has a direct effect on a family. When you have a child, you really want to be able to pass on what you know to your child. For a lot of people, there's a tremendous sense of shame when they can't teach their language to their child because they don't know it. Or they can't put their child through a certain rite of passage because they didn't go through it and they don't know who to ask. Or that item that's needed to do that isn't here anymore. We don't know where it went. So I think that's really, some of the nuances of that. And several years ago, when we did hold some ceremonies, when we brought some items back, and there were elders there that said, they want to come home. These items want to come home. They have a responsibility in the community, and the community needs that. So, essentially, I think that's part of, what we try to do when we do work with repatriation, is to try to identify those pieces that have spirit, and really provide a service within the community and are needed back home, because we have an obligation to them too.
Before we move on to, I know we have a lot of people here, and I want people to be able to ask you guys questions. I was hoping everyone would, even you, Amy, I was hoping everyone would be able to answer this question. Is like, not many people. Well, what can our white counterparts do for this journey towards healing to work, for the understanding of boarding schools to be out there? Most of them, I see and hear, oh, this has nothing to do with my people. We live through this thing as Indigenous people daily, and it's part of our lives, but how can our peers who have, political privilege, have social privilege, be able to help us as Indigenous people, or like as a nation itself, as community members? What can our white counterparts do to help partake in this journey towards healing?
Okay, well, I was thinking about this question actually, like headed here and whatnot, and I do, as a white person, as a person with colonizer ancestry, I think there's a couple things that we can do, and the first one is to start looking at that shame and that guilt and that silence that occurs in our communities, in our churches, in our families, to actually start talking about it, to educate yourself about these things, to read books. What's the book you love? White Earth Tragedy? White Earth Tragedy is a really good one, as if you want to learn about some of the historical trauma that happened on White Earth and to that tribe. But I believe as white people that it's necessary to be very uncomfortable, to go into uncomfortable spaces, to crack your heart wide open, and to grieve and to feel some of that really deeply held shame and guilt and sadness that I think we all carry. And that as a society, a predominantly white society, or that part of our society, I think tells us to just absolutely ignore and pretend it doesn't exist and stuff it and not talk about it and have this, like Olivia was mentioning, this kind of wall of silence, this wall of shame. And so I think one of the huge steps to healing for white people on our side of this is to break our hearts wide open through having uncomfortable conversations, through self-education and starting to make relationships with people from communities that have been injured by the actions of our ancestors. And it's still happening now, right? There's still genocide, there's still active racism and oppression, and that's not to say that I'm enacting those things, but I do have political power, and I do have privilege walking in the world just because of the way I look. And so I think for white people to start to acknowledge that we have privilege, that we have power, that we have a lot of silence and shame, and to start, having these conversations with our children and in our families and in our communities. I think that's a huge, huge important step to being able to actually meet our Indigenous brothers and sisters somewhere in the middle, in a place where we can all come together and have these challenging conversations and figure out how to make the world better for the next 7 generations. I have children, actually I have Indigenous children. They're brown people. They're gonna not grow up in the world with the same type of privilege that I have just because of the way they look. And so maybe that makes me more keyed into this or care about it more than some white people, I don't know. But I really and truly want to see healing for my children, for their children's children, for the next 7 generations. And it takes a lot of bravery on the part of everyone to be able to crack open and deal with the things that emerge, whether it's sadness or rage or shame. And to do that individually, in our own processes in therapy or whatever, but also to do that in community and work together towards making right what has been wronged and working towards a more just future for all of our children.
What was the question again?
What can our white counterparts do to help?
Well, my experience is I work a lot with the University of Minnesota, and when I went on committees at first, I was basically, because I'm there to stop them from genetically engineering our sacred food. And so I'm basically looked upon as kind of the enemy when we first sit down. Now, some of them, of course, I've changed too, I guess, but some of them have changed what the work they were doing. Like one was experimenting on animals. He hasn't done that in 20 years or better. From just, and so, change does happen. We do, we work. We have to both sides. There's a give, and in order to find change and healing in that, we have to, as I said, open our hearts out to one another. We can't always be looking at one another as being the enemy I was looked at. Now, we have worked together, like I said, over 30 years with a lot of them, and so change does happen. Sometimes, we don't agree on all things. In fact, I hardly agree on anything. A lot of times when it comes to protecting our ways, but we work through it, and slowly change does happen. One of the biggest changes I've seen is Jamie here, the work she does and brought to Whiter. I've seen other TIPOs come through and nothing ever happened until Jamie showed up. Man, she's bringing back items. There's work being done that should have been done years ago, but nobody ever picked it up, and with her part that she's been at it, that's a lot to do with the healing part of things. I was gonna nominate her for national National treasure. Actually, really, I mean, you know, I've never seen anyone bring that much change and hope to Whiter. You know, there's still a lot of work to be done.
I don't know what to say. Sorry. I think, I don't know, I think my thoughts on this really kind of go across the board for, I think part of it is really being willing to look at some of this history, the complexity of it, what took place. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important that schools are able to teach critical thinking and actual facts in school. I think that matters so much. Not, you know, what to think about those facts, but facts, that matters. I also think that recognizing that it isn't just history, but these are repetitive behaviors and experiences that communities, you know, are experiencing, not just Indigenous communities, but communities are being targeted across the world. And, you know, I mean, you look in the rainforest and there are people that are still being massacred because they want access to those trees. And you look at, you know, what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, there's traumatic experiences and trauma that's still being inflicted. And, you know, I think I'd mentioned before, but there's been a handful of people that I've known who went to boarding school and got out in '96. So that's when I graduated high school. You know, so I feel like I'm a beneficiary of geography, but not time. Had I been born just a little north of where I was, could have been me. You know, there are boarding school survivors that look like me. So I think that, you know, thinking about it as a far away, long time ago type of thing, I think that kind of provides some comfort because it can distance ourselves from what's taking place or what we could be doing now. I think that kind of falls on everyone's shoulders, right? To look at that and think differently and be okay with learning facts that aren't comfortable. Voting, voting like you know those facts. You know, I think those types of things really matter. I'd say with the work that's been happening here, there really has been an intertribal, interfaith, multiracial effort. It hasn't been just white and Indigenous people. There's been, you know, other people that have been working on this too. But it really has been this all hands on deck. Like there's been this small group of really diverse, remarkable, awesome people that have come together for a period of years. So, you know, seniors may graduate and someone else is coming in. And those seniors, you know, they still stay in contact, you know, when they graduate. And they're amazing, amazing, wonderful people. You know, for me, I don't have like this huge staff back at White Earth. You know, it's usually just me. And then I team up with Navy, and I'm thankful for that. But here, the students here have been able to find thousands of pages of documents that have completely changed, you know, how we're able to look at the history of White Earth in time that is, it's so much faster than what I could do. And given that some of the individuals that really want answers are elderly, you know, those individuals may well get that information that they seek while they're still here on this earth because of the students that are in this room right now. So for me, I've seen something take place here that I haven't seen with any other boarding school initiative anywhere else in the country that I'm aware of. So, so I would say keep doing that. You know, like spread that around, you know? If you ever have time to talk about that with other people. And I think that the students that have done this work here have looked at some really hard things. Not everything's been pleasant to look at, and they did it, and they kept doing it, you know, and they came up and they met community members, and they are deeply, deeply loved. So, you know, it's changed the community too, because now there are people that ask about students here, like, oh, how are they, when are they coming back, and that kind of thing. There's conversations that are happening. And so this isn't just like a simple exchange of archival information or a new land acknowledgement that's written or something, you know, this is like actual relationships that are being developed. And so I think recognizing the humanity behind that history, recognizing that this stuff is still playing out all around us, that you're either benefiting from it or you're actively working in some way, even if it's a small way, to make things a little bit better for someone besides yourself. You know, any small contribution is a huge contribution. So I would say, that's what I would say.
I've given an awful lot of thought to this question, and the simple answer that I have is I don't know. I don't think any of us know. This is not a path that's well worn. It's one we're gonna have to cut. There are other places in the world that are doing similar work. There's efforts in Germany. They've done an awful lot of work with reconciliation and with, and there's a big difference because Germany was held accountable. They lost the war. It was a period of time that happened. They lost the war. The world held them to account. But they do pay every person who is a survivor of the Holocaust a monthly fee. And to me, when I learned about this from a colleague of mine who also worked as similar to Dan Brown, in fact, they were colleagues, a Jewish psychologist working with Holocaust survivors. Now they're descendants because most of them have gone on. Now I lost what I was going to say. He talks about how the money wasn't really enough. How do you give enough money to make that kind of payment? But it was the exchange, it was the acknowledgement, it was the apology, it was the taking responsibility that allowed the possibility for a freedom within the spirit of the Germans. The Germans were the ones that really had to gain. Now there's right now happening another wave of fascism that's growing in Germany. But many, many German people are very upset about that. They're informed, they've taken responsibility, and they've done some pretty amazing things. South Africa is another place. Some of the work that's starting to happen in Palestine, it's not talked about as much. And I'm sure there's other places that I don't know about. So I think, when I think about the other work, again, I reflect on what Dan did, because after he worked with the descendants of the perpetrators and got their stories, he asked both groups of people, would you like to come together? And they said yes. And so over a period of four years, they met, I think it was a week at a time, in Israel, these two groups of people. Now, some of these survivors were meeting the children of the people that tortured them. that killed their relatives from the camps, okay? It was a very, very powerful gathering. And they had some terms. They had some ground rules that they started with. One is we must accept that what happened, happened. That is not to be discussed. It happened. The second thing is each one of us may have something about how that impacted us that needs attention, that needs to be here. And the third thing was, if we're going to come together, let us find a way to make it count. And to me, that is probably the greatest goal for something so horrific that's happened over how many hundreds of years, that continues to happen. This is not historical past. This is still happening now. When you think of the immensity, the enormity, how are we gonna make it count? And that gives me goosebumps. That gives me hope, because that is pretty phenomenal. I think about people that came here, you know, including my relatives, right? There's an awful lot of pain and trauma that was being left behind to come here to escape. So there's that history, that piece of history. The other thing is to learn about ourselves, learn about, you know, our history, which is rich, you know, the Haudenosaunee and the way they gifted the people, you know, the founding fathers, you know, with what were only ideals or only possibilities to the people that put together the Constitution. But were everyday fact. This was just the way life was. Freedom, equality, equanimity. This was common. But for people coming here, it was, if you put yourself back in that space of oppression, of servitude, of serfdom, of slavery, of indentured, you know, of war, of all kinds of strife, religious oppression, all of that was common in Europe, that people escaped away from to come here to hear these new concepts that were hard to even conceive of other than being ideal. How do we put that into practice? And we have peoples that still live, that still know, that still have those answers. So I think learning, I think humility, fearlessness, accepting the possibility that we might be wrong. And how do we sit with that? How are we gonna do it? And can we imagine a world, is there gonna be a world if we don't? Because I don't see that what we're doing is sustainable. I just don't. So, Shakespeare had a quote that I really liked from Macbeth. Screw your courage to the sticking place and will not fail. I think this is something we have to decide. We are not gonna fail. We have to do this. For our 7 generations, we have to. Miigwech mio.
Okay, we have about 10 more minutes left. I'd like to open up the floor for some questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and I'll just come over to you and hand you the mic.
post-traumatic stress disorder and the treatment of it. Could you comment on political trauma, cultural trauma, historical trauma? Is there an overlap there or treatment there that, because as a matter of fact, the Israelis have done kind of the forward-looking work on that. Thank you.
You know, that's a really good question, and I think there is. You know, if we look at how we are working with PTSD now, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that it's not a mental illness that needs to be treated. It's actually an injury to the mind that needs to be rehabilitated. And if we think of that as a micro level, you know, individually or intrapersonally, and then we carry it out to a broader macro level, then that also will give us some good indication about what we need to do with communities and with how do we rehabilitate the injuries that have taken place, the wounds, how do we heal those wounds, as opposed to seeing this as a sickness or an illness that is not, you know, that you can't recover from. That's just not true with PTSD. I've just graduated the third client in 3 months that no longer meets criteria for PTSD, right? People get their work done and they move on and their lives are richer for it. As a society, we can do this. We have to be able to look at where the injuries are. We have to be willing to move through and forward at the macro level. But this is going to take us to a new place. We don't know. That's sort of like the process happens, and then we see, then we have the ideas, the narrative thread or the ideas, the thinking brain is really the last to come on board. Everything with trauma is run by the body brain and the midbrain. And if we think of that at a greater level, one of the greatest examples that I have, this was before there was even a term for historical trauma. Amos Owen, Dakota leader down in Red Wing, Minnesota. But he, and in full disclosure, I knew him very well. He took me as his daughter. And so I was able to hear a lot of these stories. But he and his son went in 1962 to Mankato, and they had a pipe ceremony in Mankato, just the two of them, to honor the 38. Is there anybody in this room that does not know what happened on December 26, 1862 in Mankato? Is everybody familiar with the mass hanging? 38? Okay. Some years after that, they worked to have a powwow in Mankato, and it's the last traditional powwow of the season. It's usually it's always the third weekend in September. But this was the year of reconciliation that they worked on, and they had this year of reconciliation. The people that wanted to have this powwow were Amos, but he was approached by Bud Lawrence, who was non-native. And there were 3 of them that came together and created this. And it's one of the most beautiful powwows in that area. I mean, all powwows are great, but this is a really special one. And it brings together all peoples in this place of Mankato where Amos would say people wouldn't go to. People were afraid to go to. It was, not a safe place. for Dakota people. Now it's not like that anymore. And here was an example of historical, I like to think of what Evelyn Bellinger recoined the word historical trauma to historical healing, but that's really what happened in Mankato. There was a transformation that was really for the betterment of everybody, everybody. And it was accompanied by respect and love and connection and community.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone have like a very urgent question they want to ask?
You know, I'd like, oh, there. Go ahead.
You've spoken a few times about the seventh generation. Could you explain that a little bit more, what the significance of 7 would be?
I probably can't. I probably would butcher it. But the idea that I take with it is that we don't just think of ourselves. Everything that we do here is affecting the generations to come. Everything that that was done in the past affects us, right? I think there's a Bible verse, isn't it? The sins of the father are visited upon the sons. That's historical trauma. That's exactly what that means, you know? So I don't think it's a concept, I don't think it's unfamiliar, but this idea of taking care of our world so that 7 generations in front of us will benefit from the decisions, from these conversations tonight, right? And I have also heard there's a man that lives in Montana. His name is escaping me now. He's a psychologist and worked in Indian country for a long, long time. But his teachings that he got also said that just as we are impacting the 7 generations in front of us, we are also impacting the 7 generations behind us, right? And that's a pretty amazing thought if you think about it. And knowing that this one conversation, maybe one thing that's said or heard or thought or whispered will impact. It will ripple out. Can you say something about that?
No, you're right on that. 7th generations, it's basically, yes, it is teachings that that we have that young people will have a future for what we're doing, today. But the St. John's people, I'd love to see us take a look at Knut Nelson.
Ted's nodding.
Knut Nelson, I looked that up, we're talking, Knut Nelson, like in 1887, they had what, the Dawes Act, a lot of lands up. That didn't affect us on the White Earth Reservation. 2 years later, in 1889, Knut Nelson and them, they passed that, and so we started losing our land, right? And everybody here understands blood quantum, right? See, we have blood quantum. I don't know if anybody else, but that a lot of with that stealing, like our people, we couldn't sell land, full bloods, mixed bloods. They said within a certain amount of time, would be able to sell their land after a 25-year trust period. Well, within that 25 trust period, the land was disappearing. White Earth, we had 837,000 acres. Their treaty. When that Nelson Act got done with us, by 1934, we had 810 acres left, out of 837,000. And it was ripped off, so. think he learned that here at St. John's. Did he go to school here? Who knows, huh? But no, it's history. I've worked a lot. I do a lot of history. I worked with Minnesota Historical Society as an advisor for like 20 years, or 19 years. Science Museum down there for another 20 years. So I was always looking at a lot of history, but the land itself has always been a big part. So I would, read the book Whiter Tragedy. I'd also take a study on Knut Nelson and see what happens. People, I don't know, so I'm gonna end that, but take a look at it.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you all for coming. And to any student who wants to have breakfast with our lovely Joe Lagarde here tomorrow morning, please let me know or email the ISA email account. It's isa@csbsju.edu. We also have a chance to eat lunch with our lovely Olivia Janice. Also, you can just come up to me and let me know if you're interested.
Any more?
Well, thank you all for coming. This was an amazing night.